All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Polytalk EDU. Today is going to be my distinct pleasure to host two great scholars. We have Professor Judith Norman from Trinity University, and we have Dr. and Professor Katherine Gillen from Texas A&M San Antonio. Welcome aboard, folks.
Thank you. It's great
to
be here.
Thank you very much.
Glad to
Before we talk
join.
about, yes, thank you. Thank you for joining. Before we get started with the topic, we're going to be talking about academic freedom, and then in lieu to what's happening with Palestine, Israel, and the war that's been happening, and the election of the Trump administration and the impact of that on all those things involved. But before we delve into the crux of the conversation, I would like to have a quick introduction. Judith, if I may, and then Katherine, just a quick introduction. What have you done in the past, and what led you to this point? Because you both are very, very activist by nature, and then I want to see what led you to this point. Kind of like a quick introduction about who you are. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. It's really generous of you to allow us to talk about some of these issues that, as you said, we're passionate about. I have been a member of Jewish Voice for Peace for, 20 some odd years now. I was a member of the Jewish Peace News, their original sort of news distribution, news cutting service. I've been working in San Antonio with San Antonio for Justice for Palestine and the People's University for Palestine. Other community initiatives for social justice, in particular Palestine-oriented. I've been to Palestine twice and had the privilege of visiting Gaza in 2015 and 2016. I am an academic. I teach philosophy at Trinity University. My views do not reflect that of my employer. I've had the opportunity to reflect at length on what I'm able to do within a university setting as far as advocating for liberation and what that means for universities, right? I've come up against the contours and the limits and the borders of what the academy makes possible and makes comfortable. And I've found it very interesting to reflect on that and the way that these borders help police empire.
Okay. Thank you, Judith. I really appreciate it. And also, for the record, this is the third time that Judith has, graced us with her presence here. And I really appreciate your return. Thank you very much, Judith.
Thank you.
And now, without further ado, Professor Katherine, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's lovely to be part of this conversation with you both. My name is Katherine Gillen, and I am a professor of English at Texas A&M San Antonio, as you mentioned. And I've been doing activism around Palestine sort of on and off for a long time, I think, since I was doing student activism at the University of Vermont in the mostly very early 2000s. And so I've sort of come back. I think recently been inspired by the work that Judith and many of my colleagues around the city and in the profession have been doing to really try to advocate for students at our shared, institutions across the city, and also to think with other colleagues in the profession about how we can protect students and also how we can advocate for Palestine and for Palestinians and for our colleagues in Palestine who have asked us to support them. And so I think that's kind of our duty as members of the, of academic professions to do that. I also have been very active, and my department at A&M San Antonio has been active in work around decolonizing curricula. I'm a Shakespearean by training, which is a pretty colonial field, but there's been a lot of work, done in the field to think about, critical race work and decolonial work within that field. And I think that, as Judith is saying, we are seeing the kind of limits, right, to which the academy and the state will accommodate that kind of work. But I also think it's really important as an educator to be able to continue the work, especially, we live in colonized space in San Antonio, and I think we need to think about solidarity between the US-Mexico borderlands and Palestine, and also to keep thinking about like how we can decolonize curricula, but that we can't really do that within the neoliberal academy, which clearly is bound up with an imperialist state.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much for the great introductions, and then I really appreciate your being here with us today. Okay, I think we'll get started. There's a lot of topics we're going to be discussing. We really cannot ignore the elephant in the room, which is the election of Donald Trump, and then the impact it has, and all the executive orders have been signed thus far. Some of them being approved, some of them being challenged by the courts. But just kind of take a step back and understand exactly for the listener, break down to them what does academic freedom means to you. I mean, one basic definition of academic freedom is that means that both faculty and members, students and faculty engage in intellectual debate without fear of censorship or retaliation. That's just one basic, very, very broad stroke kind of definition. Do you agree with that definition? And where are we in terms of that? Are we fulfilling that basic proposition or not?
So
Yeah,
I guess to jump in, yeah, I definitely sort of agree with that understanding of academic freedom. I'd like to sort of supplement it by talking about freedom. Often we think about freedom as freedom from, right? So you're sort of thinking freedom from censorship, from repression, from sort of artificial influences that might sway us in ways, you know, that bias us or that silence us. And something I've been thinking about lately, my colleague Habiba Noor has really brought this forcefully to my mind, is academic freedom is freedom too, right? So to advocate for liberation, right? So often, you know, the test of academic freedom is sort of like, well, here's a Nazi, will you let them talk? It's sort of like, I'm not, you know, maybe, I don't know, you know, can I allow horrible speech to happen? And that being a sort of like the test case of academic freedom. I'm more interested in thinking about it in terms of what, what are the conditions in which speech for liberation is possible? Right. So thinking about academic freedom as being able to advocate for liberation. And I'm finding that, you know, it's not just sort of like the Trumpian university and this new repression, but the academy has never been a particularly agreeable place, you know, for advocating for liberation. That's often sort of seen as, you know, partisan or bringing inappropriate passion, bringing activism into the job, as opposed to sort of like it's artificial to keep that out of the job. Yeah.
Great. I mean, just very quickly, it's kind of too bad that Trump University does not exist anymore, so we can find out exactly what the definition according to Trump University curriculum. It would be kind of interesting to see what the academic freedom in those hallways. Thank you, Judith, for that. Okay, Kathryn, what's your
I would
take on this?
also add, I agree with everything that you both have said. I would add that academic freedom also involves the freedom for disciplines to create knowledge and for faculty and students to freely work within those disciplinary traditions. And I think that we're seeing there are, you know, these traditions that have always been counter to colonial hegemonic power structures that have never really been super welcome in the academy. So we can think of, say, Black studies or Mexican American studies in the United States, but we can also think of departments like Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African studies at, say, Columbia, right? And these were disciplines. So Middle Eastern studies, for example, like in the United States, those disciplines are kind of founded as like, you know, in concert with like CIA operations. They're meant for really explicitly like colonial aims, but then you also see, as you know, activists have continued to like advocate and fight for space and fight for space to advocate for liberation within the university, that people have really transformed those disciplines and have tried to create spaces, carve out spaces for anti-colonial and decolonial work within them. And I think you can see in the instance, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but of Columbia University capitulating to the demands of the Trump administration, that one thing they had to do was to put their Department of Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies department in receivership. And what that means is that those faculty and students will no longer have the freedom, the academic freedom or any other kind of freedom, to like create knowledge and share knowledge that is in line with the disciplinary standards that they have themselves created. So I think that we really see people trying to say like, no, it's like the state or the Trump administration or whomever who like dictates what kinds of knowledge is acceptable, rather than scholars, and also rather than like the people and movements that have really been advocating for liberation and that have been like kind of codified in some of these more like counter-hegemonic disciplines.
Okay. Now, Judith, you mentioned earlier your definition is freedom from, which makes it automatically a civil liberty issue, which is really, we're talking about the Constitution language, which makes things very complicated, because right now the Constitution is basically on display. What did the founding fathers meant, and then the interpretation of it, does it mean this way, does it mean that way? Just a quick question to kind of frame of reference, because I get asked this question a lot by a lot of colleagues and students and friends. Like right now, there's a lot of arrests that have been taking place from different campuses without due cause. I mean, without due process. I mean, there's basically the habeas corpus is in denial. So let me ask this question: do international students should habeas corpus be also granted to international students, or just for American citizens? What do you guys think about this? Judith, you want to take that?
I mean, absolutely. You know, the violation of due process is disgusting, right? And there's several things. There are a lot of things that have gone wrong in terms of these deportations. The violations of due process are disgusting, and it's also, I mean, it's not simply that they're inconvenient or that Trump can't get what he wants if he followed due process. There's a sense in which he's exercising or flexing a form of sovereign power to you know, to codify norm erosion, to demonstrate, you know, to his base that he's not bound by these laws. So that's disgusting. The terms on which I'm interested in sort of thinking, this will take you a little bit away from the question. I'd like to hear what you have to say about this, Kate, first. But the idea that the people who he's deporting and silencing have some sort of complicity with Hamas, I think, is extraordinarily dangerous. And I'd like to, and he's using that vocabulary to appeal to a sense of innate wrong, to bypass due process. And that's something I'm interested in picking apart as well.
Yeah, I guess I would also just say, I mean, I completely agree, right? I think certainly people living within the United States should have the right to due process. I also just think like one of the insights of critical race theory, right, which has its roots in legal studies, has been to show us that the law is not neutral, right, and that it does benefit certain people more than other people, and that it sort of perpetuates these, you know, inequities and injustices in many cases, which doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for it to be applied equally and to be applied in more just ways. But I guess I would also like to connect this too to the way the, you know, Israeli state also, which is, you know, obviously often touted as the only democracy in the Middle East and all of that, right, is also an entity that is routinely detaining people without due process. And so I think you see that in the Trump and also Biden administration support for Israel, that we have, you know, we sort of see an interest in the kind of apartheid system that the Israeli Zionist state embodies and enacts in sort of its most fully realized form in a lot of ways. So I think you can see in these deportations or these, you know, renditions, arrests, that you know, that the U.S. state is doing something similar.
Yes, I mean, to me, just but watching the mainstream media on both sides, actually. And they were saying like some of these arrests, some of them, they're trying to make justification for them. They were saying like they were involved in demonstrations, holding, like in Columbia University, like holding Hamas flags. That actually never happened. It's not, I mean, to me, there's a false equivalency between, you know, pro-Palestine and then pro-Hamas. And then if you are automatically pro-Palestine, automatically you are anti-Semitic. I mean, I think Judith and I, we've talked about this in the past. So not even, I don't think I've ever seen anybody holding Hamas flag in one of these demonstrations. It was a Palestinian flag. So right now there's an equivalent. If you are a Palestinian supporter, that means you are all these things involved. You're a Hamas sympathizer, you are anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti all those things. So what can we do? What can we do? What's your thought on this? And what can we do to kind of alleviate these kind of misunderstandings surrounding us?
I wanted to sort of take up on what you were saying, Kate, before, and this will be by way of answering this question. That this, I mean, certainly this, the norm erosion, the repression is happening under Trump to a degree to which it wasn't happening in the US previously. But it's important, in particularly understanding this issue, to see how the Biden administration, previous administrations, have absolutely opened the door to this. Number one, as Kate says, by supporting, Israeli apartheid, which has practiced these norm erosions and these extraordinary renditions and this sort of kidnapping and deport. I mean, all of the sort of legal infrastructure that is being deployed now was well honed within the Israeli regime that the United States gave an absolute green light and full diplomatic cover and massive military support to. And so if it's coming back, if it's boomeranging back into the United States and in a way different in kind from the way it was before, then it's certainly nothing new. It's our own echo of what was happening before. And also just the sort of rhetoric that the Biden administration prepared us for, the illusion between Palestinian rights and Hamas support, which I mean, I heard creeping in a couple years ago, and it just sounded like a sort of hysterical intervention, an exaggeration, people who couldn't tell the difference. I mean, I was called Hamas, right, in November of 2023. The Jewish, the Zionist student group and on campus sort of accused me of being complicit with Hamas or Hamas support. It's just like, this is, how do I even, wrap my mind around this is hysterical. I'm a member of, I lurk in some Facebook groups where parents are manufacturing moral panics over campus anti-Semitism, and they call anybody who's Palestine sympathetic a Hamas supporter, right? And I always thought that this vocabulary, which has been going on far before Trump, right, was just a sort of hysterical intervention and over-exaggeration. But now I've come to see it as a really calculated strategy that is preparing the way for Trump to deploy some of the legal mechanisms that are being prepared to crack down on criminalized speech and facilitate deportations. So, for instance, we have, sort of legal infrastructure to enable the U.S. to deport terrorists, right? Or terrorist sympathizers or people sort of providing material support to, and I sort of like, yuck, of course, terrorism is icky, that has nothing to do with me. But now we have like sort of like normal free speech activities, me saying, maybe Zionism isn't such a good thing. And I'm a Hamas supporter, right? And so I get caught up. This sort of speech, this sort of like, simply Israel critical speech that people ought to be engaging in, right, gets branded as Hamas. That's part of a calculated strategy of bringing it under the purview of some of these anti-terrorist legal mechanisms that have been evolved, and bang, you get all this sort of repression for free. It's really, and again, all of this was going on under Biden, right? Trump just comes in and sort of like puts 2 and 2 together, presses the button, and here we are.
Yeah, and I guess I would like to add too that I think part of that move is also enabled by Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, Orientalism, right? That's criminalizing. I mean, one, that's associating all Palestinians with terrorism, that's painting a democratically elected, governmental leader as by de facto terrorist, right? And so my colleague Brian Dadaboy within Shakespeare Studies just gave a really wonderful paper like talking about the criminalization of especially like Muslim speech, of words like martyrs and intifada. And so thinking about like anything that has to do with resistance to a colonial state, which by the way is protected, is sort of legal under the UN Charter. Settler colonialism is not actually like occupying other people's land, right? And so I think that there's like a way in which like this kind of like Orientalist perspective is just criminalizing any dissent, using the language of the war on terrorism to paint an entire resistance movement, both in Palestine and in the United States. So I know you asked what we can do about this, and I think that's a big question, but I guess I'd love to hear more of Judith's thoughts, but I think we just really also have to keep organizing in whatever spaces we're in, whether it's, within the city, within our institutions, within our professional organizations, because I do think it's obviously a very coordinated attack on academic freedom, but on people who are fighting for liberation, both like within the imperial core, and in spaces like Palestine.
I want to add, because
please, yes.
Again, I have a lot more to say on the question of what's going wrong than the much more important question that you've asked us, which is sort of like what we can do about it. It's like, I'd love to, hear an answer to that. But just to add to what Kay was saying, sort of, absolutely, the ground was paved for this repression, this equation of Israel critical discourse with Hamas, and we can even talk about sort of like what is meant by Hamas, right? Sort of like
exactly,
which is a whole other thing, but and well worth investigating. But so all that is paved by previous administrations, and certainly the Islamophobia and the anti-Arab and the anti-Palestinian and the sort of anti-brown racism that we've just sort of like that's just run rampant. I'll also say, right, that a lot of this sort of network, this sort of like anti-Hamas moral panic, network, is anti-Semitic, right?
Yeah.
They're tapping into for a lot of reasons, one of which is that they're tapping into anti-Semitic tropes about sort of like global cabals, right? Operating with sort of secret funds, in this sort of like, clever ways. That's an age-old sort of like anti-Semitic trope. They're tapping into that, right, to sort of like talk about the Hamas cabal, a secret network, right? By which they mean Palestinian rights protests, a disproportionate number of whom are Jewish, right? So this is actually anti-Semitic in this way. It's anti-Semitic in that the group that's sort of like engineering this, I don't know, it's like, I'm not going to say there's a global conspiracy. There isn't a conspiracy. There is a position paper by the Heritage Foundation, right, called the Esther Project, right, in which they outline, here's how we're going to do it, folks, right, and it's what they're doing. So if you want the sort of the script that they're making real now, that they're unraveling, it's all written down, right? It's sort of the Esther Project from the Heritage Foundation, written by white Christian nationalists, right? Who are using anti-Semitic tropes to uncover this repression in the name of Jewish safety, right? But yeah, tapping into anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinianism, anti-brownness in general, anti-Muslim, all of this is operating together, and being engineered by white supremacists. So, fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is an amazing thing, happening in there. You see it and you watch it, and it's sometimes a lot of mis and disinformation happening all around us, and then sometimes you kind of just make you ponder on what to do. It just came across yesterday. I was listening to an interview with Professor Jason Stanley from Yale University. He's a philosophy professor, and he was actually saying he's contemplating the idea of moving to Canada. And he actually joked about he was going to move there before it became a state or something like that, to that effect. So to me, is that a real danger where actually some academics actually are choosing to go elsewhere and then maybe fight that battle of freedom from a faraway place, or it should be worth it to kind of stay your ground and then fight the system itself, and hopefully the system will be a self-correcting system and it's gonna dissipate and go away and things will kind of normalize at some point. What's your take on that?
I guess I can start.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I think people need to do what they need to do to keep themselves safe. And I think some people really are. I mean, as we've seen with some, especially the international students at American universities, I mean, some people really are in danger. And I think we need to do what we can do to protect them. I think it's important. I mean, I'm, you know, a white person with citizenship status in the United States and, you know, in Texas. I mean, I think it's important personally, like from my own subject position, I think to stay here and to fight in this space. I mean, again, like I said earlier, I mean, we are in colonized space. I think Texas is run by, you know, minority rule, but I think that's sort of like, oh, just the sort of white liberal move to just say I'm moving to Canada, like I think that's a little different from I'm really in danger and need to leave for various reasons, right? And so I think to me, I think it's important to be clear that there are a lot of people here, right? Even in a conservative, you know, politically in a lot of ways, space like Texas, right? There are a lot of people who are doing really great work, and like there are a lot of, you know, gay people and trans people and brown people and black people and Palestinians, right, and Arabs and Muslims, you know, and other nationalities here. And I think it's just important to be in solidarity with those communities and to continue to organize. So I guess I'm in the stay here camp, but I totally realize why other people can't make that decision.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. You know, we need to sort of support each other's choices and understand each other's vulnerabilities. I think Jason Stanley might have an interracial family, which sort of makes his calculations different. I know trans friends who are moving, and, you know, God, who can blame them? This puts me in mind of sort of like, you know, what's happened to Israel over the past couple decades as the left sort of has collapsed or imploded there. And I talked to an Israeli Jewish dissident who anti-apartheid organizer, BDS organizer, who said that you know, Israel is not going to reform itself, right? It's not that this battle within Israel is not going to go well. That the thing that's going to stop Israel is international pressure. And so he moved outside. He says that my political work in terms of sort of like, you know, stopping Israeli apartheid has to be done internationally, right? That this is and it could be the case that, you know, that the US comes to that situation as well, right? I think there's so many vulnerable communities that can't leave, that don't have that privilege, that people who do have the privilege to be able to stay can do some good work in staying and sort of working in solidarity and trying to support them in their resistance. But again, everybody has their own position to understand.
Yes. Okay. I mean, there's one thing that I just want to discuss a little bit, and then have you share your thoughts regarding that. A few weeks back, when Benjamin Netanyahu came in to visit newly elected President Trump in the White House, and then when Trump, you know, made that announcement that he's gonna basically turn Gaza into, you know, something that could belong to the United States and all that stuff. And it seems like at that time there was like a ceasefire and everything else. And then when Netanyahu went back, it seems like he was given like an extension lifetime. I mean, he was just kind of given. He went and started the whole thing. He said, "Look, you know, Donald Trump is an out of the box kind of guy." And I think there was a whole paradigm shift with when he came with this ammunition from Trump. So what do you think the impact of Trump's election? Because Judith, you mentioned earlier that Biden kind of paved the way and then he kind of put things together. But when Trump came in and put two and two together, and that's like an extra thing that he did. What is the danger or what is the impact of Donald Trump presidency on fueling the ongoing crisis in Gaza right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I gotta say, I don't have, I can't give anything like an expert opinion on that. I don't, I don't see how, I mean, I don't see a big difference between, I don't see how it could be worse than it was under Biden, right? You know, I don't know that Trump is, Trump has his own, thing going, which has really nothing to do with anybody's safety. The difference I can see a Trump presidency making, I think, is more in terms of the West Bank, and letting loose some of the settler pogroms and enabling Israeli destruction of West Bank towns and institutions. I think that violence is largely flying under the radar of US media attention. And that's freaking serious. It's a place where I think Europe, for all of its massive deficiencies, has put a little bit of diplomatic energy. And so Biden sort of respected. I mean, the ghost of the two-state solution depends on maintaining certain parts of the West Bank. And Trump has, you know, the gloves are off, the illusions are gone. He is not interested in the sort of diplomatic nicety of the pretense of an eventual two-state solution. And I'm really worried about the West Bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, so what he said, and now it's like he's pedaling back from what he said earlier. The fact that he's, United States is going to own Gaza, is going to deport all the people, and it's going to belongs to the people of the world, or the world people. I think he referred to it. So is that a real danger? Is that something we should be worried about? Because he oftentimes he starts something with a joke, and it turns into, like when he mentioned something about Canada, I thought it was a joke. And right now it's not going to come to fruition, but it's not a real joke. He keeps saying, like, it makes sense. It's like, well, to whom? I mean, it's just like the Canadians are not involved in that. I mean, the Greenland also, and then Panama Canal and everything else. So, but Gaza, it seems like it's a different kind of danger, because it's been at war, almost going to be closing in 2 years, and also it's going to be it's been dissipated, and people are just have nothing to show for. So is that a real danger when Trump's saying we're going to just deport the people and then we are going to own it and then give it back to make it like an international city, whatever the case might be? Should that be taken with a grain of salt, or should be just kind of like, nah, nothing is going to happen? And I've been going to Judith for a long time. So Katherine, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have to take that threat seriously. I mean, it's what Netanyahu wants, like in terms of like the Israeli state. And I think I'm not quite sure what, I know Trump is also kind of probably talking to Christian fundamentalists there as well, and thinking about what that kind of like conservative Christian stake, is in the region. But yeah, I mean, I think they want, and I think in Gaza too, right, that they have this image of, well, it's, as though it's been, destroyed, and now they'll, you've probably seen those like AI generated models of like beachfront property and things like that. Like they seem invested in that idea of whoever tactically owns it, in this kind of like space that could be like a playground for Western capital and Western tourists and things like that. So yeah, I guess, yeah, and I agree with what you said, Mohsen, earlier, that Trump always says these things that sound nuts until then he starts to enact them, and his advisors do.
Yeah, it seems like there should be a cabinet in his administration, like throwing jello to the wall and see what sticks, and then kind of come back later on. It's like, you know what? Yeah, we didn't think it's gonna stick, but why don't we just gonna go ahead with that? So a lot of it sounds to be at the very beginning, it seems like very outlandish and almost comical. And then down the line, I mean, like for instance, when I first heard changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico, I thought it was a joke. I thought it was like a SNL,
Yeah.
skit. And it was like, what? And then it was in the Oval Office. I think King Abdullah was like, he was there like 2 days after that. And he was sitting in the Oval Office, and then it's like, oh, the Gulf of America. It's like, okay. And it's been named the Gulf of Mexico like from 400 years ago. It was before even the United States. And then the president of Mexico kind of like responded, it's like, you can call it whatever you want. In here, we're going to call it the Gulf of Mexico. So it's just like, go fish, basically. Judith, what's your take on this? On Gaza, is there a real danger, or is it going to just go away regarding the Trump
Well,
taking
I
over?
think this is spaghetti that Biden was already throwing against the wall. I mean, sort of like from the earliest days of the assault on Gaza in November of October of 2023. I mean, I don't know the extent to which Israel had a strategic plan beyond the usual periodic carpet bombing. But it quickly, I mean, fueled by, well, it quickly became, I think, a plan to colonize the territory and deport the population. And I remember a conversation, I remember hearing that the US, the budget included a line item for facilitating deportation of the population of Gaza into, sort of like whatever country the Biden administration thought would be most pliable in this. And there was immediate outrage from the Arab world. I mean, immediate outrage, right? Biden knew that this had gone a little bit too far, and so he backpedaled on it. But now, so this is an idea that's already had a test balloon go up, right? It didn't work the first time, but this is not a new idea to Trump. And I think it's just a matter of trying the patience of any country that could be prevailed upon to receive Gazan refugees. That seems to be the, and wearing down international outrage to the point where sort of like we're sort of worried about Canada being invaded, or what the, new names for old geographical features are being called, or just, I mean, we're so stunned by these, by the chaos. Maybe when Trump, tries this, there won't be the same sort of pushback. They're not, I mean, there is a method to this madness, and it's not just, chaos for chaos's sake. It has a sort of psychological and a diplomatic function of, attention atrophy, norm re-establishment. And I imagine that the eventual colonization of Gaza will, requires certain of these things to go through, and they're doing it. So yeah, I think it's horrifying. There's this sort of like every once in a while more information about the natural gas reserves will appear, and yeah. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but this is definitely an idea that they're seriously pursuing.
Yes. Let me just ask something in here. Have we had kind of a fatigueness factor regarding the conflict in the Middle East? Because this has been going on since October 7th. And again, it's going on. It's not the starting point, as we discussed multiple times. It goes way back from the occupation, from the end of the Ottoman Empire, and beyond that. But the current incident, or the current events that's been happening since October 7th in 2023, it seems like right now there's the ceasefire, it's on and it's off. It seems like the average person right now, they're very numb about responding in the proper outrage that they're supposed to do. And it reminds me in many ways, kind of like how we respond to mass shootings, God forbid, in the US. as long as it's not in your backyard, like you turn on the TV, it's like, oh yeah, 15 people got killed, and then they talk about it for 2 days, and then you kind of get the fatigueness factor, and you move on and you get outraged again. But I mean, it seems like right now there was almost over 1,000 Palestinians died in the past few days, and then not even the major networks are not picking that up because that is not a sexy story anymore. It's like it's been kind of like it's been done and done for, and they're focusing on Trump and everything else. So are we hitting the fatigueness factor, and what can we do to kind of make it also the forthcoming, and then make something out of it, and then educating the public, and then making it something that's going to be beneficial. Katherine, Judy, however you want to take it. Katherine, you want to go
Just
first?
say, I mean, I think you're right. One place where I see hope is with the student movement. In particular, I was just on the East Coast last week for a conference, and I was meeting with some students from Columbia and from Cornell and other campuses, Harvard, places where there's been a lot of student activism, and I feel like they really are not giving up, and they are really restarting a lot. I mean, in part because the repression continues. So I do think it's hard, like with the fatigue factor, but then also like Judith, like you were saying, how we have to organize against all these things, right? We're trying to organize against ICE raids on our campuses and, different things. But I do think, especially in places where they're specifically detaining students who are involved in protests, and where they're going after people for different, for their involvement. Like, I do think there's a renewed kind of interest in the movement work. And I think that's one thing, back to what we can do. I just kind of think supporting the people, largely young people, who are doing that work, but they do need support. They need money for legal fees. They need people to write letters on their behalf. They need people to join them at protests. And so I guess I'm kind of interested in thinking about how I can support some of those students, even though they're not necessarily my students here in San Antonio, but I think they're like doing a lot of heavy lifting for us right now and kind of keeping things in the news, especially in places like New York.
Okay.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that the students have broken through, whatever ideology blockade, we older folks have been sort of kept under, and maybe it's just because it's on, it's being live broadcast on social media, and they're seeing it, and they're sort of like, they're able to sort of circumvent some of the interventions that our biased media environment imposes on us. I do worry that I mean that the repression becomes the story as opposed to an annoyance on the way to the story. And I've experienced that directly, right? So now we're not fighting for Gaza, we're fighting for our right to fight for Gaza, and that's a sort of area of remove. And it's a necessary, it's a worthy one, but it does deflect attention. I've been under repeated investigation at my university. I've just had a Title VI. I've had 2 Title VI cases against me. One just concluded, and I was found not responsible for the accusations. But this has taken a huge amount of energy, sort of, legal finding legal defense and stuff like that. And all of this is, it's become a thing in itself. I am, my, I have a, well, we all have a duty to speak for Gaza. It's so dear to me. And to have to lose my time and my voice in sort of pushing back against repression, I never thought that it could exhaust me so much. So this is so several things are going on. One is, people see the forces of repression acting in utterly, what seems like utterly arbitrary, illegal, hysterical ways, and, don't want to get involved, take a step back. And people who, so people are sort of self-suppressing. And then people who aren't self-suppressing are lost in this morass of repression. And where's Gaza? So yeah, so the students are where it's at. And this level of BS that they're having to face is it's really effective. It's really effective in deflecting attention away from Gaza. And I'm so glad that we're getting this opportunity to sort of like, mourn that and to insist that our attentions be focused back onto Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And
Katheryn?
I think you can really see, I mean, I know we've said for a long time, right, that no one is free until Palestine is free. But I think you really see that like working and the way that like in that, like, right, we're not allowed, right? We don't have the freedom in the United States to speak for Gaza. We do, and we insist on that right, and we insist on that freedom, but it's being repressed. And so I think we do, but I really value, Judith, what you just said, because I think we always have to make sure to like bring it back, right, to Palestine, and to say that is, that's sort of where our attention needs to be. It's not just like an American civil liberties question.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
and sort of some of our faculty mouthpieces like the AUP, there's a tension within that about, do we fight for what we want to fight for? Do we fight for our right to be able to fight for what we want to fight for? It's just sort of like it's like
It's a vicious cycle, yes.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
back to negative freedoms, right?
Right.
Some of these groups are just sort of like, I'll defend your right to say whatever you want. And I don't want to say whatever I want. I want to say free Gaza, right? That's not, yeah.
Okay, now with this academic freedom, to kind of circle back to the academic freedom aspect of it, which is a free exchange between students and faculty, without being feared of censorship or retaliation. Do you think the institutions, not the government, I'm talking about the universities and academic institutions, have they failed in communicating or maybe kind of creating a protected environment for the students and the faculty? Because that's what I keep hearing. Like, after the firing of presidents of like Harvard and all the the big schools back east, it seems like right now with the arresting students and then without due process, they kind of like the universities right now are not really saying much regarding that. Should the institutions be pushing back against censorship and against kind of guaranteeing academic freedom? What do you think, Katheryn, Judith?
Yeah, that's such a hard question. So
It is. I'm sorry.
at a certain level, no, at a certain level, of course they should. Yes, they should. They should value their academic mission. They should create space. They should protect academic freedom. They should protect the safety of their students. They should not call the police or, troopers on their students. They should not do any of those things. They should not capitulate to the Trump administration's demands. I also think, I'm part of the Texas A&M system, or my institution is, and I think it's also clear, right, that institutions of higher learning are also part of the state, and they're also part of capitalist kind of corporate regimes. And so, universities are heavily invested in a number of kind of, a range of sort of military, industrial, complex sort of interests. I don't know what they all are, but I know that they exist. And I think, universities get grants from the Department of Defense, all those kinds of things. And so I just think, thinking about many institutions have ties directly to Israel. So I just think that we're being a little naive if we think that they will just do that. I think universities, as with all spaces, are sites of struggle. And I think the spaces of freedom that have been opened up within them have been like advocated for by students and by faculty, and that we have to continue to like fight to like create and preserve those spaces.
Okay.
I
Judith?
also think that I absolutely agree. And the universities, what they seem to be doing are sort of laying low and see if they can capitulate just enough to fly under the radar, right? Sort of like maybe if I'm quiet, nobody will notice me. Please don't tax my endowment. I think the university strategy is to sort of what's the word? To capitulate, to give in just enough to be able to maintain business as usual as much as before. And it's a highly individualistic strategy. It just sort of pits each university against the other about who can keep their head down far enough to not be noticed, right? As opposed to a solidaristic strategy of saying, what can we do if we pool our resources and start to push back against some of this? What sort of avenues could we collectively pursue? There's a sense in which, of course they're capitulating because this sort of solidaristic paradigm, the paradigm that would make that possible, is a paradigm that's foreign to the sort of neoliberal institutional framework that universities operate under. Yeah, I mean, they are used to being competitors for the consumer market of students, sort of competitors for, within marketing their brand. The sort of the corporate model of the university has prepared them to think of themselves as businesses who are just trying to outbusiness each other, as opposed to other paradigms which would, enable them to think about their relationship as, needing to coordinate, as protecting certain values, and that these values aren't just sort of like, branding instruments, or, how many ways can you sort of declare your own excellence to, attract the next class, right? But that these are things that are meaningful, and you might have to give things up, right, in terms of your endowment in order to be able to genuinely preserve them. So yeah, the strategy of pooling resources and thinking about collective action. I mean, people are sort of like, why aren't they doing that? And I think it's because, yeah, the framework that would make that way of thinking possible is just foreign to the operating procedures of universities.
Mm-hmm. And you can see how the Palestinian exception is sort of showing some of those like fault lines. So I'm a member of the I was before I left. I was a member of the Modern Language Association, the MLA, and there was a move. I mean, there've been several moves over the year to adopt a BDS resolution. And the MLA was encouraged or advised, I guess, by their council that it would be against their legal and fiduciary interests even to allow a vote by the delegate assembly of the MLA on a BDS resolution. So it was really interesting because this is an organization of, English and language professors, right, who are sort of at the forefront usually of these fights around shared governance. And they're saying like, no, we're not even going to allow a vote. And so that prompted really a number of people. I think it's at this point over 600 people who have signed a pledge not to renew their membership of the MLA over this. And we, had a walkout at the MLA Delegates Assembly and a die-in and a poetry reading, a Palestinian poetry reading, which was really beautiful. And it was a great, I think it was great to kind of see these spaces of collective action forming among people who aren't used to doing that in some cases because they're operating within these institutions, although many of the people who were involved are also doing that work in their institutions. But I guess what I wanted to point out there is just that these institutions can't handle the question of Palestine, and it's exposing this kind of like bankruptcy in a lot of ways. And we see now as Trump is trying to criminalize diversity, equity, and inclusion work and critical race studies, that like we're also not able to kind of push back against that because they've already kind of ceded ground around Palestine.
Right. Now, there's a lot of people actually, they're taking the approach of, as you guys mentioned earlier, like laying low, and they kind of like try to weather the storm a little bit. But the bad news here is there's virtually not a big difference between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to the Middle East. So a lot of times you could say you can just kind of like, weather the storm for like the next 2 years or 3 years, and then things will kind of pick up once we elect somebody else. The midterm election will bring in new waves of politicians, and 2028 will be different. But it seems like it doesn't really matter, because you're talking about Trump has inherited this from Biden, and Biden is virtually not a lot better on this than and will even Harris, if she was elected, it would have been pretty much the same way. So that's kind of brings the kind of a glimpse reality. What can we do to really kind of we really have to take a step back to understand exactly what's going on, because from a political standpoint, things are not going to change. So we have to look at it from a different venue. What might those venues be? Judith, you want to take that one on?
Well, just starting with what Kate mentioned, sort of like, nobody's free until Palestine is free. And Palestine is sort of like the central point. It's at the bottom of all this, right? I mean, and universities will sort of like throw away free speech around Palestine so readily. It's sort of like when it comes to other things, then there's a bit more pushback. But just the readiness with which they'll throw and politicians, Democratic politicians, Palestine under the bus, while defending other civil liberties, civil rights, human rights issues, makes Palestine, it's extraordinary. It's the wedge issue, right? I mean, as Kate sort of suggested, it's the issue that prepares for further repression, because we'll accept repression around Palestine, and then the legal infrastructure is in place, and suddenly we find repression around things that other people care for. So I do think that a call to solidarity around Palestine is at the very heart of this. Understanding Palestinian suffering as mattering, right? Palestinian life as mattering. That's the fulcrum. That's at the basis. And in order to do this, I mean, sort of untangling this ungodly sense that mentioning Palestine or advocating for Palestine harms Jewish students. So if Palestine is sort of like at the crux of it, anti-Semitism is the weapon that's keeping us from getting at that crux. It's absolutely vicious. So I'm glad for Jewish Voice for Peace in my group as being a visible presence in this to help push back against some of that. Yeah.
Okay. Kathy?
Yeah, I think I mean, I'm just from a political perspective, I'm interested, kind of political party perspective. I mean, the Democratic Party to me seems increasingly irrelevant. And so I'm interested in like whether there are other like political parties or groups that will kind of like emerge. I know they exist, but like that will emerge as more key players. I also just kind of find hope in these organizations that are emerging, like say the collective of faculty who are organizing around the MLA, or like the work that the People's University for Palestine is doing here in San Antonio, right? That I do think people are forming collectives that are kind of outside of these institutions that are immersed in these oppressive structures. And so I think there's hope there. I also do think, but I think you're right, it's difficult, like from the sort of mainstream politics perspective, like it's hard to see policy changing, but I think the networks that might force it to are forming. It's just that it's a hard battle, right? And so I also think that people have been doing interesting work with like uplifting Palestinian artists as well. So poets, visual artists, theater artists, and trying to like just speak to everyday people. And I do think the narrative around Palestine is changing in that I think there are more and more people who are thinking about Palestinian life, right? And Palestinian suffering, Palestinian joy, Palestinian art in a different way because of the movement. So I do think that's shifting, but it's just that as it shifts, also the political repression continues to like increase.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, to me, from my vantage point, I mean, since October 7th, there's a lot of it seems like there's a lot more awareness of the issue of Palestine and the occupation. And then honestly, I was really one shocking thing that I discovered is that you get a lot of people who are actually very highly educated, that very sophisticated, and they don't even know the basics of what's going on. They really think, a lot of people, they think it's the starting point was October 7th. It's like October 7th happened, okay. We don't want to talk about October 7th as the starting point. You know, there's a lot of other, it was a response, not the starter, okay? And then one time, I mean, there's a lot of things happening. So it creates some kind of an awareness of what's going on. And then Judith and I, in the previous two episodes, we've talked about the anti-Semitism and Zionism, and they're not the same thing. They're very different. And one time I posed a hypothetical to some people that I know. I said, just a hypothetical situation. Let's say Israel will decided, you know what, things are not really going well. The Zionist project is not working as it's supposed to, you know, initially was enacted. People are going to go back to Ukraine, to Russia, to the United States. And then they're gonna all the places, all what we call Israel, this is a hypothetical, all what we have Israel today, we're gonna sell it to the Japanese or the Chinese. Okay. Now just bear with me in here. Are the Palestinians gonna go and then be fighting the Jewish people who are in Europe now, or they be fighting the Japanese and the Chinese? They'll be fighting the Chinese and the Japanese. It's about the occupation. It has nothing to do with religion. Nothing to do with religion. Zero. I mean, you know, it just, I mean, Judaism, I mean, Jewish faith and then the Christian faith and the Muslim faith, they both are monotheistic religions. And then we have, an average Muslim does not have a problem with a Jewish person or a Christian person. It is the occupation, the occupation, the occupation. And again, if that's what happens, and then China will be involved, the war will be waged against China. It has nothing to do with the Jewish faith. And then I think there's not a lot of that going on. It seems like a lot of times when you say something, it's about the Jewish faith, it's about anti-Semitism. Right now in the United States, we can criticize the government, we can criticize the president, but what is the right dose to criticize Israel or Netanyahu without being accused of anti-Semitic? I mean, it's mind-boggling to me, you know? So, I mean, and Judith and I, we talked about this in the past extensively. And then what's your thought on that? I mean, how can we alleviate these type of misunderstandings, you know, regarding anti-Semitism and Zionism? What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I keep saying things like what you just said, right? I think it's just important to repeat that. I think it's important to like unapologetically critique Israel. I also think it's important to say that this is about U.S. foreign policy as well, that it's not, because I do think there are anti-Semitic ways of framing the question that make it seem as though, you know, the U.S. is controlled by some kind of like Jewish cabal, the way you were talking about, Judith. So I do think it's important to push back against those anti-Semitic framings, but I also think it's important to say like this is about occupation, and there are other occupations and we impose them too, but this one is really, you know, and you know, a key one, and it's funded by the United States, so that therefore we do have an interest, a moral duty, interest in and moral duty to oppose, you know, that imperialist, you know, effort.
Yes, absolutely. Judith, you have something to add? Yes.
Well, I do think, yes, absolutely. And I do think, Mohsen, the ignorance that you found in people around this issue isn't just, I mean, it's not a passive ignorance, it's an active ignorance. You know, people have been discouraged from finding out, you know, that this is, you know, way too complicated, and it's sort of, either it starts on October 7th or it starts in the Bible, or, you know, nobody, I mean, there's so many sort of contradictions and myths that are flying, and so many ways of discouraging people from finding out about this, that I think ignorance around this is manufactured in order to keep people from feeling any agency around commenting on it. And the way to not be anti-Semitic is to sort of not be anti-Semitic, right? It's not rocket science, you know, sort of like there's discriminatory language, we know what it is, and let's avoid it. People ought to listen to their intuitions as opposed to hysterical voices saying you can't criticize Israel, right? It's just not, yeah.
Yeah, it's really mind-boggling because a lot of times at the very beginning, people come in and say, "Do you condemn Hamas? Do you I mean, as it is the starting point, it's like, okay, do you condemn IDF? I mean, it's just like it's not about it's not, and again, it goes back into the fact that it's not a year and a half conflict, year and a half old conflict. It goes back how far back you want to go. And then sometimes people say, okay, why can't the Palestinians just pack their stuff and go live in Jordan or in Egypt or somewhere else? Because that's not their home, you know? And I think one time there was one colleague of mine that said, well, I mean, he's from St. Louis. So I told him, how would you like if, I mean, how often do you go to St. Louis? I go maybe every 2-3 years. So how would you like to exchange your home to get them a bigger place in Oklahoma? Would you go for that? So he goes, no, St. Louis is my home. You have the right to return at any given time that you want, you know? No one has the right to swap states, and you're a Palestinian, that you're going to go live in Egypt or Lebanon or whatever the case might be. It just doesn't make any sense. And the whole idea behind like that, right now we're talking about the right to return. We're talking about the 1967 war. Some people say 1948 is way too old for the people that left Palestine in 1948. That's way too old. But the whole premise of the existence of the state of Israel for the right to return for the people from 2,000 years ago. So how can 70 years ago is too long, and then 2,000 years ago it's kind of okay. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, just like there's a lot of inadequacies, and it's just very frustrating. And again, I am always up for a good debate. It's based on something intelligent about it. But when out of ignorance, there's nothing good is going to come out. And then you can see the ignorance in terms of the question being framed or the even the answers that they give at some point, and then they utter ignorance in this topic. And now it seems like we're making some kind of an awareness about the situation, but I'm not sure if it's not the right dose yet. I mean, it's not where it needs to be. I mean, in my opinion, I think
No.
in my sphere, in my area. So yeah.
And I'm struck by sort of like the narratives that you're taking us through. Yeah, it's ignorance, but it's also, I mean, there's racism at the heart of all of it. The sort of, do you condemn Hamas as sort of like, centering Israeli suffering, right? Then that has to be sort of equated to, the vastly a more excessive harm done to the Palestinian
Sure.
people. That equating those is racist. It's centering Jewish suffering inappropriately. The idea that Palestinians can just pick up and go to another country is racist because it sort of equates, people with of sort of similar ethnicities. It's sort of like, what the heck is the difference? Refusal to sort of understand distinctions there.
Right.
So yeah, racism is at the heart of all of these things.
Yes, it really is. It really is. Kathryn, something to add to this?
Yeah, agreed. And I also think privileging these just like settler frameworks, right, which are racist, but I think they're sort of thinking about, and like a lot of people live in Israel, like have other homes in like the United States or in Europe, and thinking about sort of global kind of like, settler culture, which obviously like white people in the United States are also like part of in a lot of ways, but like as opposed to thinking about people, Palestinians who've been on particular like, on the land and in communities for a very long time, and whose like whole like way of life is in many ways like rooted in that space, and not thinking about the real violence, right, of taking that land away just in the kind of interest of some, it's like Western, style capitalism or whatever. So I think, yeah, and I agree that narratives are so steeped in, they're so intentionally crafted, right, from these like racist perspectives.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's just like a lot of times it's just like you listen to people talking about this, and then the false narrative regarding the whole thing. It's just frustrating. And then, so yeah. So we've been going at it, guys, for about an hour and 15 minutes. So it doesn't seem that long, really. And it's been just a very organic conversation. There's one thing I want to just talk about very quickly. I don't want to say it's a lighter topic, but you know, what's your thought in dissolving the Department of Education? Very quickly, because a lot of people think, oh my God, it's going to be they're going to close universities. What does that really mean? Well, the Department of Education was established in the 70s. President Carter did it, and then I kind of went back and did some kind of homework. Even Democrats at that time were against it, and Ronald Reagan was against it. A lot of people are against it. What is the real impact of dissolving the Department of Education? And what is that going to do to our main topic, which is academic freedom? Just a light topic, right? Just another, that could be like 45-minute conversation, but we'll make it quick.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would say quickly that I think, maybe not quickly, but that I think it's dissolving the Department of Education is part of a process of resegregation that the Trump administration is seeking to enact. And so I think one of the major roles of the Department of Education was to ensure equitable education in public schools. And so I think we see from the right, especially, an attack on public schools, and also on really, like, in a lot of cases, right, trying to like segregate American life and to roll back attempts at integration and, you know, racial justice. And so I think public education is so key to that. And so I don't necessarily think the Department of Education is like perfect, but I think that
it serves a certain
it
role.
serves a purpose, and it's part of that attack. And so I do think it connects to higher ed in terms of the way, like, well, in some cases, like, programs that we're advocating, say, like my institution is a Hispanic serving institution, an HSI. And so we had grants from the Department of Education that were designed to like serve Latinx students in this area, right? And so that money has been taken away. So that's like, you know, continuing to, you know, damage those efforts at providing equitable education. And so I definitely think it does not help our efforts in higher educational spaces, and it's connected to the attack on DEI and critical race studies.
Okay, Judith, what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's what you say, Kate, is perfectly reasonable. I'd sort of like connect that to a broader point that's sort of been a theme of ours, that a lot of these institutions are, I mean, the existing institutions, I mean, heck, the university itself are highly problematic, right? You know, DEI centers are problematic for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of sort of forms of inequity that they're sort of structurally aligned not to notice, right? And I've had critiques of them. And in sort of like defending these institutions, I don't want DEI to go away, as imperfect as it is. I don't want the Department of Education to go away, as imperfect as it is. I don't want universities to be gutted, as imperfect as they are. It's important, I think, as we frame our resistance, not to want to return to the world before Trump, right? Because the world before Trump gave rise to Trump, right? But to think through, you know, I mean, I'm not an accelerationist. I don't think this chaos is anything but awful, right? But maybe a silver lining is that it gives us sort of like the freedom to imagine what would a functional institution be outside of just returning to what they were before the Trump wrecking ball came in, right? How did the nature of these institutions enable the current repression, and what would a genuinely sort of like equitable university, for instance, look like? So yeah, that by way of sort of the freedom to our imaginations that some of this might enable.
Yeah, I think it's going to have a real impact on. It depends on the state. Honestly, progressive states, they're probably going to be okay. Kind of a more conservative, deep South states, they might kind of it's going to have a negative impact in terms of segregation, or going kind of taking the clock backwards a little bit in certain states, not across the board. But I mean, I get asked this question a lot by some students who are kind of like, hey, we heard about Department of Education being proposed to be dissolved and everything else, and people, really, the average person does not know what that means. Like, what does that mean, the Department of Education? And then, honestly, like the Secretary of Education was just sworn in, and then immediately he told him, like, your job is to basically end the Department of Education, McMahon, and it's kind of like kind of a weird thing. And Trump was raving about it. He's raving about it, like, hey, she's the one that's going to end it from at an official capacity, because it just does not, serve a purpose anymore from their vantage point. So that's why I wanted to shed the light on the impact of that, and so it's going to have a real impact probably on academic freedom. If we're talking segregation, we're talking about academic freedom also. So it does have a residual impact. Maybe not positive in too many ways, maybe some, but it has a propensity of going negative, I think, from what it seems like.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, guys, I just can't thank you enough. I really appreciate it. Doesn't really, honestly, it's been an hour and almost 20 minutes. It's very, very I'm very grateful for you being here today, and I really appreciate your presence and taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with me today with the audience. And then, is there any concluding thoughts, Judith, and then Kathryn, before we bring this meeting to an end?
Just to say it's a real honor to be here with the two of you and to be able to trade ideas. I always feel challenged by our conversations, and to hear your perspective, Kate, is just tremendous. I'm really grateful for this space and honored to be included amongst you. And really glad that the conversation was able to get back to thinking about Palestine itself, and not just as a sort of, not just as content of speech, right, but as a geographical place, with, as Kate says, sort of art and joy, but also just, tremendous, recipient of tremendous state violence, genocide, and to keep that in our hearts.
Thank you, Judith. Appreciate it. Thank you, Kathryn.
Yes, thank you so much for this invitation, and it's been a real honor to be in conversation with you both. It's been a really generative conversation and has given me a lot to think about. So I really appreciate that. And I agree with what Judith just said, and I would really encourage people who might be listening to get involved in specifically opposing the genocide. I mean, especially as Israel has broken the ceasefire and continues to, encroach into the West Bank, that there's a lot to do, right? That the genocide is ongoing, and we need to oppose it while we're fighting for our freedoms and academic freedoms here in the US. So there's a lot going on, and different ways people can get involved.
Absolutely. Thank you both very much. And also, a lot of times getting involved sometimes could be the proper venue to do this, because again, playing the waiting game, if you know something is going to be different when in 1 year and 2 years or 3 years in terms of elected officials. But if the continuation, the cycle is a vicious cycle, it's like Republicans and Democrats going to be producing the same kind of leaders with the same kind of positioning with the Middle East. So we're going to be waiting pretty much for nothing to kind of go away. So I think the proper course of action is taking action, and then within the limits, we're not gonna do riots and gonna be like toppling governments and stuff like that. We're just gonna do it within peaceful means, and then just do what we do. I mean, we are in the classrooms, and then impacting the minds of and again, I tell my students all the time, I'm not in the brainwashing business. That's not what I do for a living, and that's not what you guys do for a living either. But also, we have to speak our minds and have the environment to kind of like make us say the right things and kind of like guide people in the right direction. And then, if if universities and academic institutions are not protected, I mean, where else is going to be? I mean, I mean, I teach political science for a living, so I tell my students all those taboo, topics that you're not supposed to be talking about within your families. That's the crux of this course. And if it's not safe enough to talk about these things in the classroom, it's not going to be safe enough to talk about it in at the businesses and everything else outdoor. I mean, it has to be protected academically, and then that's why the institutions and universities serve a tremendous purpose for us to kind of being inspired to inspire people. you know, so basically given the platform to do that. So with that, I really appreciate, can't thank you both enough for this. And then I appreciate your being here today, and then your insight and your intellect, and then all the contributions that you do inside the classroom, and just as important outside the classroom also. I really appreciate that very much. Audience, thank you all for listening, and hopefully we will at some point we will have you know, another episode with my two distinguished guests here. Maybe at some point when things kind of dissipate and go away, we can discuss literature, we can discuss philosophy, we can discuss other things, but for the time being, if need be, we will probably have another one maybe down the line as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.